Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Brogressive podcast. I am here today joined by Beleh and Dylan, and we have a really awesome guest today, Michael LaRosa. He was the press secretary for First Lady Dr. Jill Biden during the Biden administration. He has a lot of experience working in politics, in media, was a segment producer and writer for Hardball with Chris Matthews from 2017 to 2019. And he has a lot of experience working like in the weeds with all these people that we spend all our time analyzing and talking about. And he's actually has some firsthand experience working with them. So I just wanted to start, Michael. First of all, thank you for joining us. But
Sure. Thanks for having me.
if you could just tell us a little bit about your experience working as the press secretary for Dr. Jill Biden. What did that look like on a day-to-day basis? And how was that experience the first couple of years of the Biden administration?
Sure. So I joined we called her Dr. B. I joined Dr. B in the fall of 2019 during the primary season. I was on Capitol Hill at the time. So I had actually been a TV producer for about 7 years on Hardball from like 2010 to 2017. And then I went to Capitol Hill for 2 years, worked in the Senate and briefly in the caucus. And then jumped on the presidential. A lot of people at the time on the Hill or in DC were jumping on all these campaigns in January, the spring of 2019. I stayed on the Hill because while I really did want to do a presidential campaign, I knew it was probably the best time in my life to do it. I was a little older. I didn't have a lot of like obligations keeping me like in DC. So I could move to wherever the campaign was. And it was probably like the last time in my life that I'd really had the opportunity to do soup to nuts, from the basement up kind of campaign experience, which is what I wanted. I wanted to do like the whole early state thing and be a part of all that. But I was pretty selective and I really did only want to work for Biden. And I actually didn't make the first cut in the spring. And then I was introduced slowly in the spring to her chief of staff, Anthony Bernal, who had been with her for a really long time. And Anthony and I connected through everything comes back to your first internship, by the way, because my first internship was with the Hillary Clinton folks when she was a senator, and met a lot of my mentors in politics through that internship, who knew the Biden orbit, knew Anthony from the Clinton White House days. And that's how we were brought together. And it was very rare with the Bidens, they've been around politics for so long. They have sort of these baked in layers of advisors and staff. And it's really all about, kind of who you know and how you get connected. It's very hard to break into a circle that's been around for a very long time. So I was really grateful and really appreciated the trust that they actually put into bringing not only somebody from the outside of their orbit, but somebody who used to be involved in the media. Because a lot of staff in politics, treat the press like a hazard and a threat and very suspiciously. And so I really loved and appreciate the fact that Dr. B and Anthony took a chance on me and brought me in what became the traveling bubble, because I was her traveling press secretary. And so I traveled everywhere with her. And my job was to make sure press showed up at these small little events in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, and then, that we were being transparent at fundraisers and having a pool reporter there, granting access to the press, but making sure press showed up to cover her events. And it's very hard in a big field like that to get the press to cover, the bottom tier candidates, let alone the spouse. But to her credit, despite whatever misgivings she may have had about the press, and she probably has earned the right to have them, she leaned in to the press, willing to do anything. And she really leaned in into being a surrogate and to doing anything she could that would help him. And that was her primary role, was to, what makes the spouse unique is that they can take voters behind the curtain. They can present a view, a perspective that no one else can. And voters really appreciate that, especially in those small coffee shops and libraries and schools and in those early states. And so there were a lot of highs and lows of the campaign, obviously. As you may remember, we lost the first 3 contests pretty badly. And there was like a 2-week period where things really turned around for us. And it was a wild ride. And she was a lot of fun. It was for a while, we were just traveling commercial, and it was just me, Anthony, Jill, and Jordan, her body person. And we quickly became family to each other. And, I miss them, and it was an experience. You go through you feel like you're in the trenches in a way, because you're on the road and you're with the spouse and you're doing all these events, four events a day, traveling all over the country. And you endure these disappointments and these hardships after you've put in so much time and energy into making this happen. And when it looks like it's slipping away, you can see sort of like the humanity in people. And I was lucky that it was such a small little group of us that I got to know her so well, and she got to know me very well. And there was also resentment, because I did come from the outside and I did come from media. A lot of the staffers back in the Philadelphia office did not like that. They did not like that they were bringing in somebody who was so connected to the reporters and journalists covering the spouse, because they couldn't control somebody brand new, and somebody who they didn't like the fact that I had relationships with so many of the traveling press corps already, from not just being a producer, but from working on Capitol Hill as well. But I had known most of them for years. They did not like that. Their mode was constantly to keep Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, then away from the press and as little information as possible.
Michael, real quick, yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point about them not necessarily being open to someone that was so close to the media. I would think that if I'm running a campaign, I would love to have someone like you, because you have these personal relationships, right? We can get them to maybe produce some more positive stories, whatever it is. I read your article on MSNBC about 2 weeks ago, and you bring up how, Dr. Joe Biden always wanted Joe to be Joe. And that included, putting him in front of the cameras more, and you talk about how she pushed for him and then he went on The View the next day or that week. So kind of talk about if you can talk about kind of the internal campaign, the calculations over, putting him in front of the camera. And ultimately, I think him going on The View, I remember watching that. I was like 17 years old at the time. I'm not going to lie, I was a Bernie supporter at that time. And I think we all were. So, and I remember watching him on The View, and I was like, you know what? He can do this shit. Like, he can do this. And I just felt like the campaign, especially during the 2020 campaign, really restrained him at times, when I think Dr. Joe Biden, you're right, wanted him to be himself and go in front of the cameras and connect with people. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. And for me, I met him just when I joined, but I had known who he was as a political junkie, and I had come to know. I think Joe Biden became a household name over time, especially for a young political junkie like me in the 90s, because he was always on television. He was always on Meet the Press or the Sunday shows. He was always, he was on Meet the Press when their house was burning down. She'll remind us. In Wilmington, he was on doing a Sunday show. He was always one of the most accessible politicians. And look, I don't know exactly when or why. I have an idea why some of that changed. I think, when the Bidens left the White House, their family became a little bit more exposed than it's ever been. And the natural instinct of staff is to always protect. And that instinct can serve you well. I mean, it was definitely a strategy in the 90s. Like, if there's something, if a reporter, if they're going to report something bad about you, don't engage. Don't give it oxygen. They used to say, don't give it oxygen. Don't give it credibility. You can't do that anymore because the media system is so fragmented.
You have social media podcasts that are talking about this.
Right. Yes, you're right. And I thought we learned this lesson in the Hillary Clinton race, but apparently we didn't. But if you don't engage, if they're going to write and report anyway, and those stories get amplified and in various levels of ways, then even your supporters tend to think something could be a little bit true because
Exactly.
they want to hear from you. They want to hear from you. It is no longer acceptable not to engage the press when they're going to write something disparaging or when they are but most of the time that is not their stated goal. And this was a group that was very mistrustful. They didn't have a lot of trust in their candidate, to be honest with you. I mean, that was my impression. Now, remember, I worked for her. My job was to just implement what they wanted her to do on the road. And that was totally fine with me. I had opinions, but I didn't really share them with, sometimes we would all in the car, we would say, what the hell? This doesn't make any sense. But that was kind of the extent of it because, everybody was just trying to do their best and you give people the benefit of the doubt. But I think it was really shocking that somebody who used to do so much TV and Sunday shows his entire life had not done a single Sunday show until after we got our butts kicked on Iowa. And I'm not suggesting that, by the way, that Sunday shows are make or break or that they are something important. It encapsulates their problem, which was they want to always run out the clock. They want to avoid interaction, avoid communication, and avoid engagement that wasn't on anybody else's terms but their own. They wanted everything scripted, everything choreographed, and they wanted to do as less as possible. Anything that was unpredictable, they wanted nothing to do with. So there was...
Ezra Klein was talking to Chris Hayes about this, saying that Republicans understand that all attention is good attention and helps you in the new media environment, and the Democrats are just terrified of negative attention. And I think that really encapsulates the Biden campaign. And I think running out the clock is a great way to frame it, in part because it worked for them in 2020. It was a very specific election where running out the clock was the right strategy. You were running against an unpopular incumbent during a terrible pandemic where you had an excuse not to be in public. So I wonder how much of it is just that they ran in such a unique election that it gave them this false sense of confidence in their strategy.
And it's a great topic of discussion, Ben, but I'm actually just only talking about the entire year he was running before we got to COVID. It just surprised me that, the Iowa caucus falls on Monday. All of our opponents are out there doing what you call the full Ginsburgs, which was every Sunday show you can, going on all of them. And he was nowhere. And it was just, and that day in the car, she was just well, why doesn't he do any? And I didn't want to throw, what I wanted to say was, well, because his team is fucking incompetent. And because they don't understand the media landscape or the moment we're living in. They're these young kids walking around Philadelphia acting like they're Josh and Toby and Sam from West Wing. They thought they could bully reporters and yell at reporters and scream at them and punish them and be punitive. And it never served the boss well. It never served Joe Biden well. He never.
Well, there's also a lot of office politics within that whole campaign, but also family dynamics. Because if I'm wrong,
by the way,
sister...
I was thrilled not to be in that. And I had to go in when we would be at home in Philadelphia, but it became very rare, and I loved not being there. I loved being on the road.
Yeah, and I mean, Biden's sister was his campaign manager, and Joe Biden has all these stakes inside the campaign. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how was it for you managing the both? Like, for me, I wouldn't want to get in the middle of my friend and his girlfriend's relationship. I mean, we're in college; the stakes are a lot less. How do you manage that when it's the first lady and the president, and you're trying to manage these things? There's people who are like, and how does that work in a relationship sense?
That's a good question. And a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal did a big story on sort of the machine around the president that, I think the point of the story was that they were covering up all kinds of, I don't know, mental downsides or something in the White House.
Right.
And I was quoted in the first narrative of that. But my quote wasn't meant to sort of, it wasn't meant to lend credibility to the idea that there was a cover up or that we were covering up mental acuity. Just to be clear, in my 3 years with him, I never experienced anything like that. But everybody covers up age. Everybody tries to cover up age. All politicians, all people, that's human. But there was no cover up of any kind of mental decline or anything like that. But what was going on in that narrative? I said, one time Jill was being profiled by an Iowa reporter, and I had confirmed, I think, how many counties she had traveled to, and it was more than him. We did do more events than him when we would chart our day, schedule our day. Our events were 3 to 4 events a day, sometimes 5. I mean, he just didn't. I think he did maybe usually 2 events. Maybe he ended up doing more, but it was clear. And we publicly promoted her travel. The reporter wasn't stupid. I can't lie to a reporter and say, no, don't write that. I mean, it's all public information. It would look like we were covering something up that we would have no reason to cover up. And so, but it became an example of the control and the worry that if people read that she was doing more than him, it would demean him, or it would emasculate him, or it would raise questions about his ability, his physical ability. And that wasn't the case, but that goes sort of to the root of your question. And we didn't want to make him look bad at the expense of raising her up, right? Because my job took a little bit of a learning curve because I was used to working for a principal, and she was a principal, but she was the supporting actor, right? She wasn't the star of the show. She was a supporting actor. And it was important for me to understand that. And that was an early example of how you can get caught up in that. But the more uncomfortable stuff was like briefing her and preparing her for interviews about really uncomfortable questions she was going to get, either about her son or her brother-in-law or her daughter, or Trump and what he said about their family. And those were always unpleasant, but she was a pretty good sport about it. To be honest with you, like it wasn't fun to do, to ask her questions, but it was what I give Anthony and Jill credit for, and which surprised me about Doug Emhoff, because he only did progressive media. But even with all the, you could call it, I don't want to use baggage because that's kind of pejorative, but everything that was used against the Bidens in 20 and 2024, with all those vulnerabilities, she still took chances. She still took risks. And we did everything. We did Fox News. We did Shannon Bream, and we did Dana Perino and Bill Hemmer, and we did Jake Tapper, and we did local media. We didn't do anything unless there was a media component to it. She wasn't scared. But we really did a good job of preparing her for what those uncomfortable and tough questions could be. And, I give her a lot of credit for that year, for that whole campaign.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I personally think that the Kamala Harris campaign still function as kind of Joe Biden being at the top. I think they were maybe way too careful in who they were speaking to as well. I think it goes back to what you're saying about these campaigns, maybe not having full belief in their candidate, even when their candidate's like a 59-year-old woman who's doing 5 rallies a day, and so that's my own little personal beef. But I wanted to ask you, kind of everything that you've been through these last 4 years, like what's a big takeaway for how Democrats should run in the future, or how the party should be reformed? And I personally think if party operatives acted more like you and kind of thought more like you with the media, we'd be in a better position. But what's your advice? Or
Thanks, I appreciate that. I don't know if that's true, but I guess what I would say is, look, I don't think the party, it feels like that, sure, because there's a trifecta of Republican power, and this guy who should never be anywhere near the White House is back in the White House. But like, if you look at like the results, remember, there were 6 competitive Senate races, and we won 5 of the 6 of them. In 6 of the 7 swing states, voters backed Trump, but said no to the Republican Party on the very next ballot. In Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina's governor race, Nevada. So the party is not starting from ground zero. We're not. Look, this is a 2-seat margin in the House. There is a lot of leverage Democrats have, not in reining in the executive, but at the negotiating table for sure. Look, what I would say the takeaway should be is that there is no longer, voters are not going to accept scripted and choreographed robotic candidates. Those days are over. I thought they were over, honestly, and I thought they were over in 2004. That's what made me want to go into political communication. But apparently we have to learn, we didn't learn 20 years ago, not that you always have to counterattack. You always have to respond. But apparently we didn't learn that. And I think Hillary learned it the hard way. And some of her people at the end of that campaign acknowledged so. I was surprised a lot of those same people came back to parachute into Kamala Harris's campaign. That surprised me a little bit, because they certainly didn't react to events as if they had learned from the past. But voters want one thing from their candidates. They will forgive mostly anything. You can switch, you can change your mind, you can switch your position, as long as you are confident in what you're saying and what you're communicating. Voters want one thing from you: authenticity. They crave
exactly.
All they want. If you can't answer how you voted on a statewide referendum, if you can't explain why your position has changed, by the way, perfectly fine. Trump has changed positions a million times.
So many times on abortion, on everything.
Eating humble pie goes a long way, because you know what? Voters are actually not really all too different from the rest of us. I mean, we all have vulnerabilities. We all have imperfections. They actually take solace in knowing that you are human and imperfect like they are. That's why I loved the way Jill was never, when she wasn't reading off of a teleprompter, Dr. Biden was, she had this kind of very Northeastern ethnic Italian accent that people always picked up on. Even if she couldn't, everybody picked up on it. They loved it. And she always have smooth delivery. She practiced. Like, she's not a natural politician, and she would be the first person to say that. But it's her authenticity that makes her so appealing and talented, by the way, at being an effective surrogate. But that is what I would tell any candidate these days, is that you can't run out the clock. That's not a strategy. It's a reaction, and and it depends like what that is reactive to. Either you don't trust your candidate or you don't trust the press. But the truth is, if your candidate is comfortable and confident in her own opinions, and by the way, we hope our leaders and our candidates are, pretty confident in what they believe in at that stage of the game, they should be able to go anywhere. Like there's not a either or with podcasts or legacy media or digital media or whatever. It's not an either or. It has to be both. You have to flood the zone because so many people are getting their information in different places. Why would you alienate the New York Times? Why would you alienate Joe Rogan? Why would you alienate any of those audiences when you need as many as you can get? Yeah, I think that was not either they didn't understand it, they didn't want to take risks, or they didn't trust their candidate.
Yeah, I think
that's all. And I don't know. I mean, like I was frustrated too. I was much more behaved and quiet because I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, because I had seen what the Biden people had done to Biden, and I saw it, and I was speaking out, and it got me in a lot of trouble. Look, it cost me friendships. Saying what I'm saying to you guys in 2023, when I was out of the White House, but doing some interviews and TV and just doing like bloviating and commentary, saying the quiet part out loud got me in a lot of trouble, and it cost me a lot of friendships. And nobody disagreed with me, by the way. Nobody said, Michael, you're wrong. They just didn't like the fact that I was saying it at all. And that's part of like trying to, not protect, but guard the vulnerabilities of your candidate, and by not saying the quiet parts out, not acknowledging your vulnerabilities. And, they clearly, they didn't want to take risks. They didn't want to be doing, they wouldn't even let him do a Super Bowl interview for 10 minutes. And it's the most predictable.
Oh, it was so enraging, Michael. As like a big NFL fan, like we're all huge. I'm a big Chargers fan. Sadly, we suck. I mean, we made it to the playoffs, but like, how do you not do a Super Bowl interview? Like, why? It's so enraging. And I want, and about the vulnerabilities thing, I know a lot of people would say back in 2023, well, we can't talk about it because the media is going to run on his age. The media is already running on his age, right? The media is already doing all this. It's just on TikTok, right? There was all these videos of Joe Biden that my friends would send me, and I'm like, oh, how do I defend this? Oh, the video was cut. Like, there's all this mental gymnastics going on. Where like we shouldn't go out there and talk about his vulnerabilities because it's going to be talked about even more. But I'm like, no, the fact that you aren't out there and talking about it is the reason why it's being so widespread. And real quick, I said this during the campaign. I would tweet about this, even though I only have like 4,000 followers. But I would just tell people, like what Kamala Harris could do about, all the policy positions she's flipped on or changed. Simply go out there and just be like, look, as vice president, I traveled the country. I met Americans from all different parts of the country. And I realized that a lot of these policy positions I supported before are not practical. Most Americans don't support them anymore. And look, I am going to reflect the view of the voters. And because, for example, fracking, I used to, I said ban fracking. I went to Pennsylvania. I went to these states where fracking is so important. People have these jobs. I don't think we have to ban fracking to combat climate change. I think we can invest in green energy, also have fracking. Like, it's so simple. It's so simple. And voters are going to be like, look, at least she's listening to us. She flipped her position, but at least she's being honest and saying she traveled the country, met with all these different types of people, and she's changed her mind. And that's a good attribute to have.
Yeah.
Democrats overestimate voters in most cases, but I think that's the one case where they underestimate them, what they're willing to accept. And especially if you seem like you're being very upfront about something and authentic.
Yeah, exactly. And guess what? She even had that your answer is great for her. All she had to actually say was, well, look what the Biden-Harris record. Look what we've done over the last 4 years. We have produced records amount of oil. We have auctioned off 1.7 million acres of the Gulf of Mexico for drilling. We granted permits for drilling faster than Donald Trump did in his first 2 years. We've greenlighted the Willow Project. We produced record crude oil at 12 to 13 million barrels a day on average. And Donald Trump never got close to that. He never got above 12. We did. That's all she had to say. Talk about your record. Talk about what we've done. Yes, say I've turned, but look what we've done. We are drilling. If you watched Fox, and God love them, I would go on and explain this, and they probably thought I was living in a different world. But just go look it up. I mean, there was no energy shortage. We were drilling the entire time. In fact, the environmentalists hated us for it. But she was not willing to say that, probably because I'm sure she was scared, or they were scared to offend environmentalists. And that's where comfort and principle and clear communication, standing on principle, that's like where that comes into play. And the fact that she couldn't do that and defend our record of 4 years of oil drilling to the fracking answer, which I agree with you, by the way, fracking was an outsized issue that they used against her. And for one slice of Pennsylvania, one little slice in a corner that cares about it, but it was way overblown in terms of its significance. And all she had to say was, look how much oil we fucking produce under this administration.
What you just outlined is like the biggest indictment of Kamala Harris going back years. I think it's running with the main philosophy of not wanting to anger anyone, which means that you don't actually make anyone happy. And I think that was the same campaign she ran in 2020, where she tried to not anger the left-wing side of the primary campaign and also the moderate wing, tried to please both of them, and then didn't really find a lane because neither of them were really that big of fans, because she was trying to seemed wishy-washy, appealing to everyone. You talked about earlier when she refused to say how she voted on the California proposition about public safety and like increasing criminal penalties, and then ended up passing with 70% support. I think that's the best example of that. That's something where literally 70% of one of the most liberal states in the country agrees with it, but you were too worried about angering the groups online who would have complained. And so do you think that's something Democrats are going to actually take lessons from? And I mean, obviously the discourse is, but
look, I hope so. I mean, I thought we learned some of these lessons a long time ago. I thought, especially given Trump's willingness to speak like a human being, that people really appreciate. I was a little, well, I don't want to say I was surprised. I mean, like the Biden stuff, they were unadvisable. You couldn't, I mean, look, the whole Biden thing, seeing his undoing and the way it happened. Look, it's sad. It's sad to think about, especially, because I think about her and how much pain she probably is in, and anger and frustration. And, but look, you can only lead a horse to water. You can't make them drink it. And it didn't matter how many people were saying, do this, do that. I mean, they didn't care. They didn't want to do, this is the Biden people. They didn't want to do Meet the Press. They didn't want to do the Super Bowl. They didn't want to go on a TV tour after the Her report. They didn't want to defend. They didn't want him defending his own son and defending his own honor and integrity, when you could see his reputation and his trust and his personal likability just tumbling. It was remarkable. I've never seen anything like these major violations of common sense crisis communications. Never seen anything like. And then the ultimate, what really killed them, you guys, is not so much the debate. I mean, that was bad, but it was how they responded that really broke Democrats. It was keeping him off of TV for 8 days after that train wreck. I would never.
I think a train wreck is pretty light.
I mean, it was shocking that even people who I know are smart have such terrible instincts, or don't have the guts to say, this is not going to cut it. 20 minutes on a Friday night of a holiday weekend with George Stephanopoulos is not going to answer questions. It's what I call satisfying the question. You're not going to satisfy curiosity by pivoting, what they call pivoting or whatever, or dodging or not answering the question. Voters know when you're being a phony. They know it very well. They sense it.
In that circumstance, silence was the answer. By them not doing anything, they kind of just put him in the nuclear bunker and just let the people run wild with whatever narratives they wanted to.
Ultimately, he would have still been the nominee had people in Congress not planted like a flag.
Right.
Do you think they just underestimated that and didn't think that like there was as much backlash among electeds? Like, were they just completely unaware?
Yeah, look, I just, my friends who are chiefs of staff in the House and in the Senate at the time were perplexed. They weren't getting calls returned. They weren't, the Biden response was to send a BCC email to members of the House. That was the letter they sent.
Basically telling them to shut up, right?
Telling them that he's running and he's going to win. But how many times have we seen Trump go to Capitol Hill now as president, as ex-president, as candidate? I don't know why Biden wasn't in that meeting with the senators. Some of those senators he's known for over 30 years. And my friends on the Hill, my friends who are chiefs to these senators and Congress members, they were shocked. I was surprised, but I wasn't entirely shocked because I know what that operation is like and how arrogant and just the amount of hubris was incredible. As an outsider to see that they thought they could get away with some of these things, like not doing interviews.
But you can also understand their logic. Like if you are, it is kind of a dichotomy of what they were trying to decide, which is like, we don't want to expose him because he's too old, while at the same time saying he's energetic enough, he has enough wherewithal to still run a campaign. Those two things are like competing ideas. But going back to Dr. Biden, obviously in that time of the campaign, it was kind of imploding. Do you feel like, and you expressed some frustration with the main Biden team about not using Dr. Biden the right way. Do you wish they took more risks with her and took, like, if they took more risks with putting her out in front of the public, do you think, like from the Biden team, helping out and deciding what they did?
I mean, look, and
what risks do you think they wish they had like asked of you?
Me or her?
Of Dr. Biden.
Because I was not with them. Let's be to be clear.
Right, 2023, right? That's when you.
I left. Yes, in 2020, the end of 2022.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right. I was like, instead of, I didn't understand why there was one day. This is like a more of a tactical example, but their inclination and their instinct was always to do stuff with Hollywood, and they went with some actor downtown to the Trump trial, an actor who was like 85 and could barely, was such a nightmare, visually, audibly, and just tactically. I don't know what they thought when they should have been putting. There was something that happened that day when I said, well, I don't understand why Jill Biden wasn't on The View doing this.
Defending her husband.
Yeah, or like something happened. I just remember thinking, what is going on? I mean, I wish Jill would have done more. I wish the Jill of 2019 and 2020 was the Jill of 2023 and 2024. But this was a group that from day one of the White House operated as if they were in a bunker and everyone else was out to get them and Biden. And when you operate in that kind of mentality, it leads to exactly what you saw: distrust of the candidate, distrust of the principal, distrust of the press. You never saw any of their press getting better. I mean, even Dr. B, her press was terrible. She got terrible press. They were admonished by the White House Correspondents Association because they violated so many rules. The press stopped traveling with her, and they couldn't get press to go on foreign trips, even like her signature trip to Sicily at the end. They really, the mentality really led to a really bad relationship and hostility between both sides of the house and the press. And I gotta tell you, like, that gets you nothing. That got them nothing. It got the boss no credit for anything. When you treat the press so poorly and you are punitive and punishing and constantly hostile to them, or downright lying to them in some cases, as that team did often, and then there will be a moment when the principal always needs the press. And when he needed the goodwill of everybody, he didn't have any. There was no goodwill, no trust left in the tank. And after that debate, if the press was holding back, I mean, they put their foot on the gas and they didn't stop on the reporting, on the palace intrigue, on everything. I mean, it was the New York Times, Axios, Wall Street Journal, and they did incredible reporting. And they made mistakes on their own. Karine at the briefing room, she would go out there. They wouldn't give her all the information, and then she'd have to walk it back. So you see how tightly they controlled information that even for the public interest, I mean, even after he wasn't the candidate during the drone stuff, remember how frustrated people were, right? I mean, Senator Kim from New Jersey was like, they are not satisfying the public interest and the public concern with their responses. They are just not being transparent enough. They're not communicating enough. And that was them to a T. That was how they always were.
Well,
Yeah.
Michael, I heard on the relationship with the press, I heard you on Tara Palmieri's show, and I thought it was really interesting. You were talking about kind of the origin of the Biden family's mistrust of the media and what Joe Biden's image was going into that first presidential run, and how he was kind of seen as like the next JFK and this young guy, and how like the media's coverage of him with the plagiarism scandal kind of soured that relationship until today. And that a lot of the Biden people distrust. Could you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was a super interesting way to look at it.
So, look, when Dr. B and him started dating, she was a senior at Delaware. He was 32 in the Senate. I think she was, because she had transferred, and she was like 25, 26 or something when they started dating. And he was elected while she was there. The only experience she had with him was, until 1987, was, this guy was the sort of the Kennedy of Delaware, the golden child of Delaware. I mean, he was, because he was young and handsome and got a lot of national attention on his own right. I mean, he was the first. So many of his colleagues in the Senate in 1976 were running for president. I think 7 of them. And, it could puts people in an awkward situation. It did in 2008 with Dodd and Biden and Hillary Obama. And he didn't endorse any of them. He went on a limb and endorsed Jimmy Carter, and he took on a big national role. He got a lot of national press coverage. He was groomed to be sort of the next JFK. He was groomed to be the next John F. Kennedy. He was what every Democrat put their hopes into. And he passed on running in 84, probably smart. And, 87 was really an open free-for-all. And so many people were going to run in. So it was almost like, okay, he'd been in the Senate now for 15 years. People have always talked about him running. If there was ever a time, this was it, right? Young, good-looking, attractive young family, articulate, great orator at the time, accessible, and charming. Joe Biden is charming. He is funny. He is fun to talk to. And that's part of the tragedy and how they, put him on a leash lately. But in 87, their friends, Gary Hart and Lee Hart, were the subject of a lot of press scrutiny and investigatory work on his sex life. Gary Hart went down. And then it felt like to Dr. B, she was young. She was like 33 at the time. And, to her, it felt like the press turned their eyes on whoever, was most weak or vulnerable or whatever, who, like a target that tried to target people. And that's how it felt to her at the time. It was, look, she doesn't like politics. She does what she does for him. And so, he had been reelected a couple times. Her experience was mostly really great. The Senate Spouse Club, all those things. But in 87, when that stuff happened, when the plagiarism thing happened, and I don't, look, I think it was a cascade. It was a really bad cascade of events, right? He had quoted somebody several times giving this speech. And the one time he didn't attribute it, it was taped and the tape was sent to a reporter. The reporters wrote it up. And then everybody started digging into his history and, went looking at his grades. And was he telling the truth about his grades? And then it turned out one of his speeches that he had given, lifted a passage from RFK, and it was actually a staff error, but the boss owns it, and so it was like a dominoes series, right? And kind of what happens when there's a feeding frenzy, and they got caught up in that, and it was devastating for her. She was attracted to him because of how he presented himself and his strength, and what she would always say, his strength, his character, and his integrity. And that was the first time she had ever seen it questioned. And so even as a spouse for 15 years at that point, it was the first time she cried about politics. She was really, really sad. And when they dropped out, and you can kind of go back and watch the video in like September of 1987, she's kind of in a stare and kind of like a daze when she's standing next to him. And then they go into a Senate staff room, because he's about to chair Supreme Court hearings. And Supreme Court hearings are a national stage, and he's the Judiciary Chairman. And he said something like, well, to his staffer, he was like, oh, at least I can just focus on trying to do a good job with this. And like, she doesn't do this often, but she like cut the staffer off and, put her hands on his shoulders. And she just said, no, you have to go fucking win. Because I think she knew it was a really good opportunity for reputational rehab, because he was leaving one national stage and he had the opportunity to command one. He was given an opportunity so quickly to rehabilitate himself. And for the most part, that was the beginning of his reputational rehab. And but I think, to your point, Ben, why I bring that up is because it was such a scarring experience. To them, it was like the press was coming at them and people were telling them to get out and pressuring him to get out. And it almost felt like those couple of weeks after the debate, to me, I wasn't there in 87, but it kind of replicated the same sort of pressure cooker that they were in. And when the Biden family is kind of, I think after that moment in 87, they learned like to not let the press and not let the pundits and other outsiders push them out of anything. And, that was the mentality they took in our primary campaign in 2020, when people thought he was too old, when he didn't think he could win, when they didn't think we could win the nomination, when they didn't think we could beat Trump. We couldn't get anything done in Congress. We were going to get killed in the midterms. And so to them, it just was a natural kind of autopilot to say, we're just going to prove them wrong again.
they bought into the Biden mythos, like him being this underdog and
yes,
everyone's out to get him.
I don't blame them for. I can't blame family. It's the family's job to believe in each other and the candidate. It's the responsibility of political practitioners to deliver uncomfortable truths, especially when you have a responsibility to not just the country, but like political party as well. And that's where they went wrong. Or somehow they misread the tea leaves. They misread their popularity, or they just didn't care and thought incumbency was, all powerful, and maybe could have been, but they made so many what I'd call like death by 1,000 cuts that it was impossible to give them the benefit of the doubt. If he had been doing, if he was showing, not telling, after the Her report, doing that Super Bowl interview, which they actually needed more than anything because the Her report came out after they had already declined to do the Super Bowl, they should have changed their minds and done it. If he had been showing, not telling, he may have gotten the benefit of the doubt that it was just a bad night. But it was so rare that he engaged with the media that in unscripted settings that the debate only confirmed people's suspicions.
I wonder if you bring up that death by 1,000 cuts kind of feeling around the campaign. Wonder if similar to like
that, but it certainly looked like that.
Right. Yeah. How it felt to the public. But I wonder if kind of like Biden's other bounce backs, if it was like a one big moment, like you plagiarized, like own it, admit it, you're done. I wonder if that would have been more of a bounce back opportunity rather than like, you're not doing this interview, you're not doing that interview. I feel like there was like, kind of like you mentioned, there's so many small things that you can't control all the small things. If it's one big thing, it's like, you plagiarized, let's focus on that. Let's change the story.
The tragedy of this whole story is like the missed opportunities. And this is like what it's hard for me to understand about them, people who I would think have been around politics for a long time. But most voters do not meet their candidate. Joe Biden's charming, and he could charm you. And he was always a good retail politician. But most people won't meet their politicians and be able to know that about them. We view how we connect and get to know our leaders and decide who we're going to vote for is because we watch them on a screen. In the 60s, it was on a TV screen. Now it's like a computer screen, a phone screen, you name it. We only get to know them in that capacity. And if they're only talking at us and reading to us from teleprompters, which everybody knows is choreographed and staged and not an authentic portrayal of a human being. What was great, what everybody loved about Joe Biden was his humanity. And it was the one asset he had that they really, really wouldn't let him use in the last 2 years of that White House. If people had been conditioned to see him talking and engaging, despite his age, we all knew what his age was. Well, nobody didn't know he was old. It was the fact that he was blocked from engaging and communicating with the voters directly.
So you do feel like it was, I know it's kind of like a conservative conspiracy that Biden was a puppet president, but do you feel like it was, and I'm not claiming that's what you're saying, but do you feel like he was blocked? Like that was something Biden as the president wanted to do? And
I think that was the consensus of his staff, was that we should make him walk with a group of people so they can't see how he's walking. We need to make him take the shorter steps on Air Force One. Even though when he tries to salute, the ceiling is in the way and you can't see his head. And the majesty of Air Force One really is sort of downsized to that little hole in the belly of the plane. They did things like that really hurt him, that the press wasn't stupid. Like they could see through it, that they were just trying to make him as inaccessible as possible. And I don't think it was because he was a puppet. I think it's because that was their consensus, that they agreed together that they weren't going to engage, that he was president, and there was a lot of hubris in being an incumbent. They were very hubristic. They're a very entitled group. They were even when we were losing the primary, I was kind of shocked at some of their like approach to everything. But it was by saying screw the press and screw the New York Times, and then just bitching about it on Twitter and calling them names and one of the things that really made me angry was that everybody was just in poll denial. The polls said the same thing for 2 years. Nothing changed.
What about the 13 keys? I heard that they showed Biden was definitely going to win.
The Alan Lichtman guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's down
know.
bad now, guys.
Bro
Come
was
on.
wrong claim was claiming it.
But when they're running on a threat to democracy and they're trashing the free press, which is like, I don't know, number 2, free press is like what, Article 2 in the Constitution, and they're undermining journalism and reporters and calling it disinformation from legacy media outlets like the Journal and the Times and the Post, and denying the polls. It was always too early for those numbers. Did you notice? It was always too early. Even though the polls were kind of saying the same thing from 2022 on. I don't know. So I don't know why they felt like they had to do that. I mean, everybody thinks it's because of his abilities. So if they know that, then that's a real dereliction. And that is like a responsibility you owe to the leadership of Congress, of the party. And if they knew that he couldn't handle it, they should have, green-lighted a competitive primary. In the speech he gave in January of 2025, he should have gave in 2023. And January of 2023 should have been the kickoff to that primary. But they said, no, we're going to run, and we're going to actually do everything we can to make sure nobody else can run.
Yeah, I think that point is really important, because I even think if there was a primary, I don't think that many notable Democrats would have run, like a Governor Whitmer, a Governor Shapiro. I don't know. Maybe
think
they
we get
would
the same result.
I also think we get the same result.
So you think that if there was, like, if he had gone out at
and
the
said,
appropriate...
challenge me, come challenge me, I think it would have been Marianne Williamson and Dean.
Right. No, he would, even if they hadn't, like, screwed with the primary calendar and tried to...
South Carolina's first.
It was all, but that was because they were scared he was going to be embarrassed, right? Like, you could see through all these amateur, like, again, going back to the beginning, staff or the people who are confident in their candidate don't run from the press. They don't hide. They don't try to change primary calendars to show a big win right away because you're nervous you're going to lose. Like that's not a lot of confidence in your campaign or your candidate. And so if you're trying to rig the primary outright from the beginning, they clearly knew that there was a problem with the depth of his support or lack of it.
But I think if he drops out though at the end of 23 after the midterms, I think we get the same result. I think Kamala is nominee. Maybe she gets a little more practice time to kind of get
I think that'll be
hold of her, like talking
time.
But you could also make the argument that then she gets attacked way more in a primary over that time and becomes
maybe
less
she's
popular
able
with the base.
I think actually the more Americans saw her approval rating went up even more. Like her favorability rating.
She a better sprinter or she a better marathon runner?
I think marathon runner. I don't know. We'll see. But I think that the more Americans saw her and her debate performance is really good. I mean, look, I'm a big and she lives.
But I think the important thing is she wouldn't have. I don't think someone else would have jumped in and beat her. Maybe they would have tried, but I think it would have been a similar calculus to their like mini primary campaign in the week that he dropped out. Like I don't know who would have.
Democrats are too loyal. I think at the end of the day, Democrats are just way too loyal. Even when the sink is shipping, they're too loyal.
What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, well, look, it's a party that is really really establishment driven. I mean, there's not a lot of room for rebels or challenging authority, or like it is very what they call it hierarchical, I guess.
Yeah.
And people were, I don't know why people didn't say anything or do anything. It's fear. It's fear of
Is it fear of like your
being,
job being lost, or like what
yeah,
is
well,
it?
it's fear of, it's a professional consequences.
Oh,
It's like being, if you were to come out and say Joe Biden should not run, like you were going to be, oh, you're going to forget being invited to the White House Christmas party. You weren't going to be like invited. You weren't going to allowed to have tickets to a convention, or even when the party unites. Like, it's pretty vindictive.
I mean, you can look at AOC and her whole
Mhm.
House of Representatives leadership debacle, or even just Justice Dems in general. Like, they started out, especially AOC, being the opposition voice within the Democratic Party, and within a couple of years, they're immediately fall in line. It's you see AOC and like Bill Clinton on the same stage. It's like you fall in line, and you're rewarded for that. And if you're not, we're going to challenge you in the primaries. We're going to take leadership positions away from you. You can't be the opposition person in the Democratic Party.
Well, I will say this, and look, the best leaders can keep their teams together and lead their teams. Pelosi, in the end, was very good about keeping a very diverse, very fractured caucus disciplined and voting the same way for the most part. And she was an incredible leader at getting people to steer in one direction. That is a testament to her ability to not just count votes, but to lead. And she's a good political tactician. She has good instincts. And, what does it say about Biden's leadership of the party that, support within his own party crumbled in just a matter of weeks when it was probably the most, it's probably the most beleaguered he had ever been in terms of political fate, like on the line. But again, there's hubris there. It's like, no one's going to do this to the incumbent president. No one. And look, the only person who was able to lead with a lot of support, Nancy Pelosi, was able to. It wasn't all Nancy Pelosi, and like that's a sore subject for the Bidens, I'm sure. But she had a history of keeping a very diverse caucus with many different interests geographically, blue dogs, new Dems, progressives, the squad during those years. I mean, they learned that. I think the squad also learned that if they want to be productive, there's nothing fun about being in Congress. It's compromise isn't exactly fun because you don't get what you want and you have to declare victory anyway. That's what it's kind of.
I wonder what you think about this. Is like I agree with you. Nancy Pelosi is probably one of the most skilled politicians of the 21st century so far. But I wonder.
That's why it wasn't even as close as much as she loved Joe Biden. Loved Joe and Jill Biden. They were so close. They were very good friends. It wasn't personal to her. It was literally about winning.
Right.
It was
And
not
I wonder.
about her.
I wonder. Oh, go ahead.
It wasn't about her or Joe Biden. It was literally somebody putting the party ahead of. She put the party ahead of herself when she stepped down as leader, and she relinquished power. And this was not personal for her. This was just politics. And you know what? It should have been that way for the people around the president, and it should have been their responsibility, not Jill Biden or the Biden family. It was the people around him that should have showed him how bad the lack of enthusiasm for him to run again was.
And like the internal polling numbers being a 400-point electoral loss or something like that, internal polls,
I think
and them just not telling Biden.
Yeah, I read the story. I think it was in the Washington Post about that Schumer seemed to cooperate with, but or the New York Times by Annie Carney, detailing what Schumer did and driving down to Delaware and getting in the car and crying afterwards. But the one detail in there that stuck out to me in that report, which was incredible journalism, was I know the room that they were sitting in because I've been in it. It's their screened-in porch at their beach house. And remember that meeting with the senators that his staff had that he didn't even bother to attend to make the case for himself? His longest friend in the Senate currently, because I think he's been there the longest, Jack Reed from Rhode Island is not known to make waves, and he's not known to say much of anything, to be honest with you. He stays out of the press. He doesn't make waves. When I used to go to caucus, he rarely spoke at caucus. He's a very senior member of the Democratic Party, and so he's known Biden forever, since the 80s. To know the fact that Biden didn't know that Jack Reed, with tears in his eyes, said he won't, in that meeting with his staff, said he won't support him until he takes 2 cognitive tests. That was, it wasn't, I mean, yes, it was shocking that Jack Reed did that, but that is the level, that was the seriousness of the political situation Joe Biden was in and clearly didn't know. And the fact his reaction, as reported, is even more horrifying. That his own that the people around him did not tell him that his oldest friend was conditioning support.
It was crazy.
But doesn't that kind of go to isn't that maybe the biggest indictment of all, that if a president isn't cognitively capable enough to like get any information on his own and can have literally anything just hidden from him by his young advisors and doesn't have the ability to like Google it, isn't that kind of proof that he shouldn't have been the
It goes back to like Dylan, what you said about why the puppet part and like why he just went along with their strategies all the time, right? It's kind of the same thing. I mean, the president should have trust in his advisors. Look, there are plenty of people in Washington who look, and it's hard. I will say this, it is hard, but these people have been like, the reason like they've been around him forever is because they know him best. They should be able to have the hard conversations with him. That was the whole purpose of them being there, is because the insular, inner ring could talk to him, and it was all he would listen to. But if you can't, if you're just going to say yes to everybody, to the principle, if you're not going to tell them the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, then there's really no purpose for you, because there's plenty of people who will tell any boss what they want to hear. Like, they're a dime a dozen.
It's the fantasy trope. I'm a Lord of the Rings super nerd. It's like the King of Rohan getting like the little creepy guy whispering in his ear, telling him exactly what he wants the king to do. It's like at a certain point, you also like, yes, you're right. You should be sitting there. These are talented people who know their fields. They know their industries. They know defense. They know foreign policy. But you also have to be able to be like, okay, sometimes you just could be like, are you sure about that? Or can I go fact check this with someone else? Or
Yeah,
can I
but that's the thing.
operate a computer enough to look it up on yourself? Like,
that's the thing. I mean, Biden was not a very decisive person, and our administration was not defined by decisiveness. I would say part of the most frustrating about Biden was that whether it was doing interviews or whether it was coming out for a position, it was always like they had to be backed into a corner, whether it was on voting rights or something else, or whatever. There were so many things that their hand always had to be forced to get him to do the right political thing. But Biden himself is actually really hard to handle, because he does probe so much. He does do exactly what you said. And so I don't know. Look, I wasn't there, so I don't know. I only read what was reported. But yeah, did you ever see The West Wing?
I haven't. I'm sure Beleh has.
I just started watching it Great show.
Good. It's really good. So yeah, in the last season during the presidential campaign, the candidate is.
Oh, are you spoiling it, Michael?
No,
God,
but I will say
okay.
one great part where they're bringing on a consultant and he's like, so what did you think of my speech? And she's like, well, I didn't think your joke was very funny. And he said, well, what did you think of the argument? She was like, I don't think anybody's going to buy that. And he goes to say, did you like anything about what I did? And she'll be like, oh, sure. She said, oh, sure. But there's plenty of people to tell you that. And if you can't find any, just tell me. There's plenty of them everywhere. I'll go find them for you because they will tell you how great you were. And I'm sure you have plenty of people around you to do that. And like, she was right. I mean, she's right. It's the people who are going to tell you that was terrible. That was a mistake.
Yeah. You made the kind of comparison between Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. How like Nancy Pelosi is this leader who has control of her caucus and the party. Do you think there is almost like a mutually exclusive crossover between being electorally popular and being a good political whining and dining person? Because I kind of think like Joe Biden was probably not very good at the state at either of those things, but like Barack Obama, for example, was very electorally popular at certain points in his career. Also, as president, wasn't the best at like operating within Congress. I don't know.
No, he wasn't. In fact, he didn't get
He had
anything
Biden
done.
go and he'd sent Biden a lot of times to go meet
Right,
with Congress.
right.
people.
Yeah, I mean, look, Obama changed, the face of the industry of healthcare as we know it, and people have more access to coverage. It's not always more affordable, but definitely have more access as a result. More people have healthcare today. But the party was also decimated at every level after that, and he couldn't work really with Congress very well, and didn't get much done after 2010. He didn't really get anything done that wasn't done by executive action after we lost the midterms. And somebody said it to me this way. Somebody who worked for Obama and Clinton on a senior policy position said one time, Bill Clinton's biggest problem was that he was always the last person in the room because he thought he could convince anyone of anything if he could just talk to them. Obama's problem was the opposite. He was the first one out of the room because he didn't care whether you agreed with him or not. He knew he was right, and he wasn't going to waste his time trying to convince you. Biden is much more like Bill Clinton in that respect. Biden loves the Senate. He loves legislators and lawmakers, and he is willing to spend the time. And but I do think I don't know. I don't know if like the best of Biden was there those last 2 years, but
Right.
I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I don't want to take away his decades and skill as a good politician, as a good retail politician, as a charming, likable, funny, talented campaigner and politician, because he was all those things, and he was that in 2022. But I don't know why we weren't allowed to see that when he was in the last political fight of his life.
Yeah,
you
I think
have to show, not tell.
It would have been nice to see that finally, that wrap up in the right way.
I agree with you. To me, it's a really sad and tragic story, because I think so much of it could have been avoided.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of transition just real quick before we close the episode into the future and what you're doing currently. So you are at is it Ballard Firm? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, it's called Ballard Partners.
Ballard Partners. If you want to tell us a little about that, and if you guys are accepting any
Ballard
interns, that
I don't know how many interns who would sign up for it. So I work for a bipartisan firm, And there are many bipartisan firms in Washington where after people leave government, a lot of people join, like, because the best consulting firms in town that the private sector wants advising them are not ideological, right? Because their bottom line is their bottom line. Like, they are job creators and profit earners. Like, they care about how government and politics is going to affect their business. And it's not just the private sector, but it's, there's labor unions, there's nonprofit organizations, and there's academic institutions. So you will read that my firm represents, that we represent TikTok, and we represent Harvard, and we just signed the LA 28 Olympics. We have foreign governments. We have the financial sector, the tech sector. It is cross-industry. We come from all sectors, or we are bicameral, bipartisan. But for the longest time, there were only, the Bush alumni and the Clinton alumni kind of, had monopoly over the lobbying world in D.C. And like most of the country, the private sector assumed Hillary Clinton was going to be president. And so when Trump became president, there was no firm in Washington who had direct connection to the incoming White House, because Trump didn't want any Bush people around him. So there was no real access points or connectivity to the private sector and the new administration. And that's bad for everyone, to be honest with you. But one firm in Florida, who was a Florida firm that represented the Trump organization in Tallahassee, and did their state work and environmental work, zoning, and things like that. And it is called Ballard Partners. The firm with I'm trying to think about Pam Bondi's firm and Susie Wiles' firm. So I was the Biden. So when they opened up a Washington office, obviously they were quite popular, and they lasted and stayed through the Biden administration. They brought on me when I left government, and because companies needed help, not just companies, like I said, labor unions, organizations, and colleges, things like that. They all have a government relations department. The CEU system does. You have lobbyists. Everybody has lobbyists. They just probably don't know it. But we're a bipartisan lobbying firm, and our partner Pam just became the Attorney General. A former partner became the White House Chief of Staff. And so it has a lot of history in Florida, and this is a very Florida-centric White House. But it's a bipartisan firm with people from former Trump administration, Biden administration, and we work together for our clients. Yes. So it's called advocacy. Some people say lobbying, and they like to say, the perception is that it's a dirty word, but in reality, lobbyists, are there to advocate on behalf of somebody's best interests, whether it's a college, a grocery store, a social media company like TikTok, or a small business, a woman-owned small business that I lobby for. So, it runs the gambit. But, I went there in 2020. I started in Ballard 2023, and it was anybody knew what was going to happen in Republican or Democratic circles, and went there because it was a good opportunity, and and politics is what it is. Raise money for Democrats and Republicans. It probably sounds weird to young people. Washington actually isn't as partisan as it seems. Like, we do all socialize together. And a lot of us end up working together at some point when we all leave government and politics, and we all are, doing something different outside of just my team versus your team. It's the client's team.
That was something that I was pretty shocked to when I was interning on the Hill.
Yeah.
The famous, I think maybe it was Hillary Clinton or someone said that, like, House of Cards, West Wing, those aren't the most realistic. It's Veep, and that's how people much more close to how people act.
1000% Veep is much more having worked at the White House and Capitol Hill now. Veep is definitely the most accurate description of Washington. It's I think because they had good consultants on that show who tried to make it as real as possible.
Well, I don't know if that should be comforting or terrifying, but it's
exactly
a little bit of both. But it's been awesome having you on, Michael. I think we'll wrap things up there, but it's been great to get such a unique, insider perspective into all this. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And you guys can see Michael. He was on Fox News yesterday, I believe. Very good interview.
On Will Kane.
So we're taking on Will Kane. It's fresh off the Versillo podcast. Awesome. Well, this has been another episode of the Progressive podcast. Thank you guys for listening. Make sure to stay tuned to the Progressive feed for the next episode. Many more exciting guests to come. But thank you guys for listening. Have a good one.
Thank you, Michael.